Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess game. A little warning on this one. This is more like a podcast than an action video. So if you're looking for a bunch of games and pictures and, things that we do on the board, you might want to jump to a lot of my other videos. I only have one or two other videos that are more like podcasts, and this is going to be one. What I'd like to talk about today is intermediate time controls hinder improvement. Now, when I say this, people jump to all kinds of conclusions. I've seen many times listed on the web, Dan Heisman says that you should never play fast games. I've never said that in my whole life. I've never told anyone not to play fast games. I think fast games are great. I think they're one of the best ways to learn your openings because openings are the same whether you play a slow game or a fast game. You can always look them up afterwards in a database or a book or an engine, and you could learn what you should do. And whether you played the game as a fast game or a slow game, you should learn the same amount out of the opening from looking it up. It really doesn't matter what the speed of the game was. Fast games are also good for practicing your time management. They're good for your tactical ability to see if those same puzzles everybody says, those are so easy, I can solve them really fast. Well, when you're playing a fast game, can you see those same things and not fall into easy traps and lose material by playing safe moves in your fast games? These are all really good things to do. Having said that, I will say, though, that if you want to be a really good player, it makes sense to play a ton of tournaments, a ton of really, really slow games. When I say slow games, I usually mean something slower than 35. What do I mean by 35? 30 minutes for each player plus a 5-second time delay or increment. 35 is about the minimum speed that the U.S. Chess Federation will use to rate for as a slow chess. But even better is to play something more like they play at the World Open, like 40 moves in 150 minutes with a 10-second time increment, followed by an extra hour if you make your 40 moves. Online, there's a slow set of games that are not as slow as the World Open, but they are 45-45. Each player gets 45 minutes with a 45-second increment. And that kind of game, if both sides are taking their time, could take 2.5 hours. And that's the kind of chess, of course, you need to do. Why do you need to do this? Well, it's easy. You need to do it because in order to find better moves, you have to have time to compare moves. Let me read you something that I wrote in one of my books. I wrote a book called A Guide to Chess Improvement, which was published by Everyman Chess. And I want to read to you a chapter I call The Fun of Pros and Cons. And I say, the following applies to anyone who wants to improve their game. 1, if you want to be a better player, you have to make better moves. Obvious, right? 2, if you want to make better moves, you have to make better decisions about the moves you play. Either that, or you have to be in an opening database. You have to be inside your knowledge. Well, most chess moves are not inside your knowledge. You can't memorize the entire game of 40 moves. You might play 8 moves a book, but then you have to play 32 moves on your own. It's how well you do on those 32 moves that really determine how good you are. So again, if you want to play better moves, you have to make better decisions about the moves you play. 3, if you want to make better decisions, you have to at least compare different moves to see how good they are, based on your evaluation of the positions that result from those moves. And finally, 4, if you want to compare different moves, you can't just consider one move or idea, and you must have the time it takes in order to find those multiple moves and make those comparisons. The more you find these multiple moves, we call these candidate moves, and the more you make these comparisons, where you analyze one move, you analyze another move, and then you compare the two to see which one you like better, the better you get at it. And you also get better from reading annotated master games where your evaluation skills get better. You get better from analyzing with other good players. You get better in a lot of ways, but the whole idea is that you can find better moves when you play. A lot of people think I'm joking when I say if you want to be a better chess player, you have to learn how to find better moves. They think that that's like redundant. They think that's silly. But actually, there's a lot of truth behind that. You can't just go and memorize a bunch of opening moves or look at a bunch of tactics and expect to run into the exact same position in a game. If you run into a similar position as a tactic that you studied, you still have to analyze it to see if the tactic that you studied still works in that position, unless the position is absolutely identical and you can remember it as such. Okay, so you're going to need to compare moves, and you want to compare which one is better. For instance, suppose you have move A, and you think that your opponent's best reply to A is move B, and you think after that you're going to reply move C. That'll create a position in your mind that you can imagine using your visualization, which I would call C prime. And after that position C prime, you're going to evaluate it to see how good it is, which you could call sort of the E of C prime, the evaluation of C prime. Then you might have another move X, and you might say, well, if I do X, his best move is Y. And then you'd say, well, if he does Y, I can still do Z. Now you have a new position, Z prime, that occurs after you make move Z. And you have to evaluate Z prime. Then you're going to do a comparison, and you're going to compare C prime, the evaluation of C prime, with the evaluation of Z prime. If C prime is better than Z prime, that probably means that if your analysis was good, that means move A is better than move X. If the evaluation of Z prime is better than the evaluation of C prime, then move X is better than move A. But that's the kind of thing you have to do. And if you watch my videos here, like my 20-minute exercises or my videos on thinking out loud against the computer, that's exactly what I'm doing. Of course, I don't call things A, B, C, and I don't call them X, Y, Z, and I don't say I'm going to do the evaluation of C prime. I don't say the evaluation of Z prime, but I'll just say things like, well, if I go rook A D1 and he plays rook A D8 and then I castle, that's a little bit better for me, but suppose I play rook A D1 and he doesn't play rook A D8. Okay, maybe that's a different B. All right, well, if I don't play rook A D1, maybe I'll play knight to C3. All right, well, knight to C3 is interesting, but then I have to watch out for him playing A6 and B5 and trying to remove the guard on the E4 pawn. So again, I'm evaluating an X there to see what kind of Y he's going to play to figure out if I can get to some Z where I can evaluate the position. So we're looking at those different things. Now, what's all this got to do with intermediate time control's Hinder improvement? All right, I'm going to make a statement that is pretty true, which is the more chess you play, the better you get at chess. Okay, so let's say you take someone and you just teach them the moves, and they've never played a game before in their life, and you then have them play 1,000 5-minute games. Well, that's a little bit cruel because people who just learned how to play can't finish a game in 5 minutes. They don't have the board vision to do it. But will they be better after those 1,000 games than they were at the start? And the answer is, of course, they'd be a lot better. They're gonna develop some capabilities of figuring out where the pieces go. They're going to get some evaluation capabilities. They're going to learn a little bit about tactics and principles. They're going to be a lot better after they play 1,000 5-minute games. No, but the question is, will they be a lot better after 1,000 5-minute games than they would be if they played 1,000 2-hour games? Well, the 1,000 2-hour games takes a lot more time, and we agree with that. But there they actually aren't just making hasty decisions. They're actually getting to think about their moves. So, yes, the 1,000 5-minute games were, quote, good for them, but it wasn't the best thing that they could do, and it wasn't the best thing they could do per unit time either. Let's say they, instead of playing 2-hour games, they played 15 or 20-minute games. Well, that may seem a lot better than the 5-minute games because now they have a little bit of time to think on each move. Let's do a little math. If you're playing a 15-minute game, that's 900 seconds. If you have 40 moves in a game, 40 into 900 goes something like 22 and a half. You have 22 and a half seconds for each move. Well, 22 and a half seconds, that's not a lot of time for following. If you see a good move, don't play it, look for a better one. Because you're trying to make sure your moves are safe, and you can't check to see if your moves are safe in a very little amount of time unless you're extremely good at basic tactics, which most people rated under 1,700 are not as good at that. So when they're playing speed chess, they make silly mistakes and they lose material. All right, well, when you're playing a 15-minute game, it's not like a 5-minute game, but at 22 and a half seconds a move, you're not going to come up with too many candidate moves. You're not going to figure out which ones are safe very well, and you're certainly not going to be able to compare them to each other to see which ones are better. So all those skills are a little bit lost. And when you want to be a really good player, if you want to be an expert or a master, the U.S. Chess Federation and FIDE are not going to give you titles for playing 15-minute games. They give you titles for slow games where you have at least 30 minutes. And on those games, you need to check out your moves to see how good they are and how safe they are. And these skills require visualization. But when you're playing those faster games, your visualization is not being tested very much because you can't say, well, if I make move A and he make move B, what should I do for move C? It's very hard to do that if you're not a very good player already in a 15-minute game. Sure, Magnus Carlsen can do that. I can do that. But if you're not a very good player, it's very hard to visualize a lot of moves in a 15-minute game because you're not good at visualization to begin with, and you're not improving that skill, and you don't have enough time to really look ahead and try to place in your mind where all the pieces are and what you're doing. So what I find when I get people who start playing today after the Queen's Gambit or during the pandemic, and they play all these fast games, their visualization skills are terrible because they just hand wave their whole game. If you don't know what hand waving is, check out some of my earlier videos on hope chess and hand waving. But they do that, and then they wonder why they can't get any better. So we're getting back to the title of our video, which is Intermediate Time Controls Hinder Improvement. I use the word hinder. They don't prevent improvement. Again, if you take someone who's really weak player and they play 1,000 15-minute games, are they going to be a lot better than they were before they did them? And the answer is probably yes. But they'll also get a lot of diminishing returns, and they will get into bad habits that if they do want to play slow games and they do want to try to become experts or masters or play in real tournaments where you have a lot of time, they're going to get into these bad habits that they're going to have trouble breaking. That's why I use the word hinder. Intermediate time controls hinder improvement. I always get misquoted and people say, oh, Dan says intermediate time controls are like bad for you. Well, they are if you consider hindering improvement to not be a good thing. Well, I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think that makes you a worse chess player. I just think you have better things to do with your time. For instance, let's compare playing, let's say, 1,000 15-minute games with playing what would be the equivalent, maybe about 245 games. I think that you would get a lot more improvement and get into a lot less bad habits if you played 245 games than if you played 1,000 15-minute games. I think the 15-minute games are going to give you diminishing returns on what you're getting. You're going to get into some really bad habits when it comes to checking for safety or not visualizing things or playing hope chess or hand-waving your moves. All these things are going to happen when you play all those speed games and those 15-minute games and you think that they're really slow because everybody else is playing 5-minute and you're giving yourself all of 15 minutes. But what's going to happen is you're just going to have all these problems later if you really want to try to play better. Now, if you don't want to really be better, that's okay. You can play any speed that you want. The problem I see is that people come to me for lessons and they play these millions of 10 and 15, 20-minute games online, and then they all say they're stuck. And when I test them and I check to see if they can find better moves or they can make safe moves, pretty much across the board they can't. And when I try to explain to them, well, you really have to start out slower and kind of work your way into learning how to think, they're very resistant to that. And they say, well, I can only play at lunch and I only have 30 minutes and so on. Well, they're right. If they can only play at lunch, sure, you could play 3 5-minute games, or you could play 1 15-minute game. That's true. But if you have this goal in mind, you watch the Queen's Gambit and you say, wow, look at all these masters. I want to be a master. And then you go online and you say, all these people are playing chess. I'm going to play 15-minute chess and get really good. Well, you're not going to get to be a master. You have to play really well in slow tournaments to get USCF, US Chess Federation expert title or master title. And in order to do that, you need to play really slow games, and you got to play them really, really well against really good players who know how to analyze, know how to visualize. They know a lot of things. They don't just memorize a lot of opening books to become good. And you have to be able to analyze as well. In this same article I wrote, The Fun of Pros and Cons, I give this picture from a game that one of my students played. And in this position, White has just played knight takes d4. Let's go back a half a move here. White plays knight takes d4. Okay, in this game, my student took exactly 8 seconds to play for black. And I believe in those 8 seconds, he had plenty of time on his clock. This wasn't a speed game. I think it was like a 45 game. He had a lot of time, and he played bishop takes d4. And after the game, I asked him, why did you play bishop takes d4? And he said, well, if I take with the pawn, that doubles my pawns, so I wanted to take with the bishop. This is what I call hand waving. Hand waving is where you don't use analysis to make a move. You use general principles. And here the general principle he used is double pawns are bad, so he figures taking with the bishop was the right way to take because it doesn't double the pawns. Okay, but what I say in my article is when I was learning how to play, and by the way, the first games that I played were 50 moves in 2 hours. In other words, I got 2 hours on my clock to make 50 moves, and after I made 50 moves, they gave me another hour to make another 25 moves. If you can compare how incredibly much slower that is than like playing a 15-minute game, it's like on the order of maybe, I don't know, maybe 12 times slower than a 15-minute game, depending on how you figure it out. Anyway, so when I had this time, I realized, okay, well, what you need to do is you need to compare the two moves that black has to win back the knight. You have to create pros and cons for each one. So one of the pros and cons that my students saw in this position was, if you take with the bishop, you're not doubling your pawns. That's a pro for bishop takes d4, and it's a con for e takes d4. But there's a lot of other pros and cons that are involved here, and if you don't like doing those pros and cons, it's going to be tough to play with the big boys. So let's do some of those pros and cons. Well, what's another con of taking with the pawn besides doubling the pawn? Well, that pawn on d4 is now a black piece, a black pawn that gets in the way of the bishop on a7, and not only is the bishop blocked by that pawn, but the white pawns are also interfering with its other moves. So after you play e takes d4, the future of that bishop on a7 may be a little bit problematic. On the other hand, there's a very, very, very big issue here that my student in his 8 seconds did not consider. And that is, if black plays e takes d4, he's attacking the knight on c3 with the pawn on d4. I call this idea AWL. AWL means attack with something worth less. And attacking with something worth less is a very, very, very important idea in chess. I have a whole video on this that I did a couple years ago that you could look on this channel. But AWL has the very big advantage that it's the kind of threat that pretty much forces a piece to move, because you're threatening to win material if he doesn't. So after e takes d4, the knight on c3 has to move. Well, he has places he can go. He can go to d5, he can go to e2 and attack the pawn. He can go to a4. But the problem is that is a tactic. It removes the guard on the e4 pawn, and black can now play knight takes e4 and open up the e file where white hasn't castled. Well, already if this was a speed game, if I was playing a 5-minute game, and I was looking at those two moves, I would probably quickly grab e takes d4 and get ready to play knight takes e4 on the next move. But in a slow game, I would look further than that. I wouldn't just stop and say, I think I've proved that e takes d4 is better than bishop takes d4. I think at this point, I've pretty much shown that it's probably better, but if I want to be a good player, I can't just go by probably. I have to figure things out. So let's look a little further and see what could happen. If e takes d4, white could play knight e2, attacking the pawn on d4. Now the problem is white's bishop on f1 can't come out, and white can't easily castle and get his king off of the e file, which is going to become open. But let's take a look at it anyway. E takes d4, knight e2, knight takes e4. White can play d3 and attack the knight and fix the pawn on d4 so that later on he can play something like bishop to b2 and then pile up on that d4 pawn. So e takes d4, knight e2, knight takes e4, d3. Let's say the knight goes somewhere. The knight could go to c3, but then after knight takes c3, d takes c3, b takes c3, white can play something like rook to b3 or queen to c2, and he's probably going to win that pawn, although we still have to look at moves like bishop d4 there. So we're looking at lines like e takes d4, knight e2, knight takes e4, d3, knight c3, knight takes c3, d takes c3, queen c2, bishop d4. So black is holding on to the pawn. Black could also throw in rook e8 check first, and after bishop e2, then play bishop d4 and hold the pawn. So that's a possibility for black if white plays d3. White could also simply play bishop to b2 instead of d3. So we're looking at e takes d4, knight e2, knight takes e4, bishop b2, hitting the pawn. What could black do to save that pawn now? He could play d3, but then white could play something like knight f4, and he's got the pawn on d3 attacked twice. The problem is now the black knight on e4 and the bishop on a7 are attacking f2. So that's going to lose for white. After d3, white would have to somehow block that. And I don't think he can. So let's look at that again. E takes d4, knight e2, knight takes e4, bishop to b2, d3. And no matter where the white knight moves off of e2, black can take on f2 and win. So this is the kind of visualization you want to work on. Let's show you what that looks like if you're not good at visualizing things. I always have people say to me, Dan, why don't you move the pieces when you're doing this? And my answer is always the same. Well, you have to learn how to visualize. I'm trying to show you what I would do, which is to visualize. You could always stop the video, get out of board, and make the moves. You can always pause the video at any time and do that. But occasionally I'll move the pieces just to show you what it would look like. So here's what I'm saying. After e takes d4, knight e2, knight takes e4, I can't attack this pawn again with bishop b2 because black plays d3. And now he's got a double attack on the f2 square. He's threatening bishop takes f2 mate. And no matter where the knight moves, bishop takes f2 is checkmate. So white can't do that. All right, well, what does that mean? That means that after black plays knight takes e4, that white pretty much will have to play something like d3, and after knight c3, knight takes pawn takes. That leads us to our other position. Yeah, he has to play pawn takes knight. He can't throw in rook checks first because the knight will come back and win a piece. So therefore, black has to take. If queen here, instead of bishop d4, he could play rook checks, bishop e2. And now he could hold the pawn with bishop to d4, or he could even play something like queen to e7, hitting the bishop again. Now queen takes c3 allows mate on e2, and black's much better here. So the more we look at this, the more it looks like taking with the pawn and removing the guard on the knight is going to be better than taking with the bishop, which is what my student did in 8 seconds. Do I have fun when I do this? And the answer is yes. And the name of this article, which was in the book, A Guide to Chess Improvement, is The Fun of Pros and Cons. Here, I'm trying to figure out, is it better for black to take e takes d4, or is it better to play bishop takes d4? The superficial don't double the pawns is not enough. The more incisive remove the guard on the e-pawn looks like it should be enough. And then if we look further, it seems to validate the fact that taking e takes d4 and removing the guard on the e-pawn is what you want to do. But again, when you have these 15-minute games and I test my students on things like this isn't what I come up with. I get more of the, yes, I want to not double my pawns kind of thing, the kind of hand-waving. And occasionally we'll see a better player will say, well, yeah, I want to play e takes d4 and then go after the e-pawn. Well, that's very reasonable in a 15-minute game, of course. But you want to develop your skills more than that if you want to really be a good player. Let's ask Stockfish what he wants to do here. Stockfish, what's the best move? Top 2 moves for black. Stockfish says it's not even close. Dan, your analysis is correct. After e takes d4, that's about 2 pawns better than bishop takes d4. White's best move then would be knight d5, a move we mentioned, but we didn't actually try. And then black plays knight takes e4. White will play bishop d3, hitting that knight. Black plays rook e8, threatening to discover check, and white plays castles. Again, I'm just visualizing that, but let me show you what I'm visualizing. E takes d4, knight d5, knight takes, bishop hits the knight, rook goes to e8, threatens a discovered attack, and white castles out of it, but white's down a pawn, and black has a good position. He's about to kick that knight on d5 out of the way with c6, and it says black is pretty much winning this game already. That knight has got to go to f4, and black's just going to blast open the center with his extra pawn, and white's position is pretty awkward here. So instead of playing the bishop takes d4 that my student played in 8 seconds, it turns out doubling his pawns would have been a very, very powerful removal of the guard, pretty much winning the game for black already. But again, do you have fun taking time to figure those things out? Yes, that's what I mean by the fun of pros and cons. In 5-minute games, you're just going to play fast, and if you lose, you set them up again. In slow games, you're going to learn how to compare moves. You're going to learn how to think. You're going to learn how to visualize. In the 15-minute game, 20-minute games, well, it's better in terms of getting better per unit time probably than the speed games. The problem is you're still going to get those bad habits. And what's worse than the speed games is you're going to convince yourself that you're playing serious chess because gee, 15 minutes, that's one of the longest times that the server offers you, because, you know, if you go on chess.com or other servers, they don't have a button for playing 2-hour games. They figure they're getting the casual fans who are not doing that. They know the tournament people can go out and play tournaments. They figure people online don't have as much time, and they're right. So their buttons are pretty fast, and you know, maybe the slowest button is 30-0 and the second button is 15-10 or something like that. And you figure 15-10, well, that's one of their slower times. I'll play that. And that's okay. If you're just trying to have fun, nothing wrong with that. You will get to be better slowly. The problem is that you get into those bad habits, and if you really want to be a good player, that's not how everybody got to be a good player. I got to see Fabiano Caruano and Hikaru Nakamura play as kids here in the big tournaments in Philadelphia, the National Chess Congress, the World Opens. You know, they came down, they went all up and down the East Coast playing in all these slow tournaments. You know, that's what I did. I played slow tournament after slow tournament. And those millions of slow tournaments are what get you there. If you don't believe me, you can go to the uschess.org site, go under chess players and ratings, look up Grandmaster Lenderman, Alex Lenderman, and you'll look at his rating history. It took him about 11 years to go from a 900 player up to about a 2600 player. And in those 11 years, he played, I believe, I'm trying to remember now, I think he played 11, I think it was, I think he played 700 slow events in those 11 years. Well, that's more than one slow tournament per week he played in. More than one tournament per week. And almost, if you look, almost all those tournaments are slow tournaments. Very, very few were fast tournaments. He had a few tournaments where it was like 30-minute tournaments, and occasionally he might play in a speed event, but almost everything was, you know, games where he has at least an hour, if not 2 hours for the event. And week after week after week, year after year after year, that's what Grandmaster Lenderman did. Okay, so today was a little bit of a podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I call it Intermediate Time Control's Hinder improvement. They don't stop improvement. They're not bad for you. They just can get you into some bad habits, and there's better things you can do if you want to be a good player. All right, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please tell the other people about my video channel, Dan Heisman Chess. You can subscribe and like the video as well. See you next time. Bye.